Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest Urban Manifesto webinar. Urban Manifesto has been created by myself, Lucy Bullivant, the founder of the webzine urbanista.org for livable urbanism, together with Prathima Manohar, who is the founder of the Urban Vision platform. The reason we created Urban Manifesto is as we transition through the pandemic into the new era that awaits us, the whole environment and the conditions under which all of us are enduring and grappling with at the moment raises profound questions about the policies, about the identities, and the processes of urban design and planning. Now, today's theme is density, boon or bane, and in a minute, Prathima will explain our theme in a little bit more detail and introduce you to our two splendid guests. But briefly, the idea behind the Urban Manifesto, as we are thinking and yearning to make progress in this dire situation and making the best of the situation, is to literally to create a manifesto together with our expert guests from many, many different disciplines, and across, hopefully in the end, we're going out live every Tuesday from every single continent in the world. The idea behind the manifesto is to create to help create a better, or play our role in creating a happier, healthier, more livable, and that means more equitable urban future, urban places, towns, cities that have learned hugely from the recent past, the distant past, the present, and are best placed to take up the cudgels and move into the future in a better way. So we're very lucky, we're so happy that we're partnering together with the 100-day studio of the Architecture Foundation, which is staged literally daily from April, May onwards, and until the end of the summer. I would also say that as we're moving forward, we're addressing the challenges that I just described. We're also fundamentally learning, and we are also at the same time unlearning old ways of doing things that have proved to be are now they're up for renewal. They're out of date. They are not relevant, and they're probably never even very helpful in the first place, but they're definitely not helpful in the 21st century. And what this means, we are creating a roadmap for a resilient, progressive, and responsible mindset and set of strategies for urban change. And finally, I would think that the thread of our thinking is also, in a way, summed up very well by the late poet and civil rights activist Maya Angelou, when she said, "Do the best that you can until you know better, and when you know better, do better." So over to you, Prathima, to introduce the theme and our two guests. Thank you. Hello, Prathima. Have we lost Prathima? Let's just check. She's here. I know she's hiding temporarily. Maybe she needs to just call back in again. She's the mastermind behind this whole live streaming studio. So okay. So let's just wait a short while. So before Prathima will do her bit in the most wonderful way, but maybe what we do first is I will briefly introduce the two speakers. So we are very happy to say that we have Anna Minton, who is the extremely well-known author of books such as Ground Control, and the other title is Big Capital. Is that right? Sorry, I've just...
Yeah,
that's right. Big Capital, which is all about London. And she's a reader in architecture at the University of East London. And okay, Prathima, you were having a... we were very happy that you're back again. So far, I've been...
Yeah, it's like the Murphy's Law. Things go wrong.
Yeah.
So whatever has to go wrong goes wrong. We've just had a storm and my internet went off for a few minutes. I'm in a tiny village in the southern coast of India. So, sorry about that.
We had a cyclone, so it's maybe even better to...
We have really bad weather right now, but I'm glad all of you were on speaking. And I want to say about the theme that we are speaking about today. The COVID-19 pandemic has significantly altered our cities and our urban life and all the things that we love about cities, the buzz, the diversity, the great buildings in our public realm, they've all been taken away from us because we've all largely spent our time indoors. And the pandemic has largely hit the densest parts of our world at the start. New York and London. New York's been the hotspot, and maybe they were hotspots because they are the control center of the global economy, but there has been a ton of debate on if density caused some of these cities to be, at the heart of this pandemic crisis. So as we imagine the future of cities and lay a detailed agenda to reimagine the future of cities, it's a great time to think about density and how to make density work for us for a better life. So we are so excited and thrilled. I don't know if Lucy shared a brief biography of our speakers, but Larry...
I've introduced Anna, and so I think if you introduce Larry, that would be fantastic.
Larry, I met you in your beautiful city of Vancouver, which in a way made density more livable. I walked through the beautiful West End neighborhood with you, I remember. Larry is actually, we are so thrilled to have him. He's often called the father of Vancouverism, which is an ideal of livable urban density. And it's a city that all of us should go and visit if we, at least in terms of design, want to think about what makes a great place, which is also dense. He was the co-director of planning at the city of Vancouver, and he recently published a book on Vancouverism. So thank you both for joining us. I love the background, libraries behind both of you. It's great for production value. How have you been doing during this lockdown?
Well, it's been very challenging because we have 2 primary school age children, and we have to, or attempt to, homeschool them alongside our jobs. So it's been challenging, and I think our government has not dealt with the pandemic at all well in comparison to other countries. So we're still not back at school. It's been very challenging.
Larry, what about you?
Well, my situation has been a little different. I live in a very supportive community, and we found being home and being in the community has been pretty positive. And we have a pretty good healthcare system, a public healthcare system. So our government reacted very quickly, and we've been in pretty good shape. Actually, I have felt more anguish over the last week or so about the protests around the world that's brought forward and highlighted the racism that is still there, that was there before the pandemic, is there during the pandemic, and will hopefully be solved after. But that's caused me more problems in the last few days in my thinking than even the pandemic itself. It's just the way it is.
You know, our first segment to this show is the Urban Manifesto, where we've asked both of you to summarize your 3-point plan to rethink urban density as we reimagine the future of our cities. Larry, should we start with you? I have the images that you've shared with me. So what is your 3-point agenda for the future of urban density as we reimagine our cities?
Well, let me just start by saying that on the one hand, I think densification in cities remains absolutely a requirement in order to get to better cities. But density is complicated. Density is not a simple thing. You have to realize there's a difference between density and crowding, that there's good density and there's bad density. And I'll come back to that, you know, sometimes we talk about density for people and the human needs, but equally there are objectives related to environmental responsibility, and also even efficiency of government spending and all of that. But we're finding that you have to really address all these together, because it's such a complicated thing. And very importantly, density is different according to where you are in the world, what your culture is, and what your tolerances are. Now, as you could just see from that image that was on, Vancouver has chosen density. We've found out that we have to use density, but we found also that most people hated density. And so we had to take off on a process to figure out what good density was. And in a few words, good density is about not only bringing people together, but it's about diversity, it's about community supports, and it's about amenities. In other words, creating both livability and taking pressure off the environment. So there's 3 images. Here's the first one that really make the point. If we could go to that first one first. No, not that one, the next one. You'll see that, the next one, please. Yeah. Density starts in terms of good density. It starts with complete communities. It starts with communities that have housing and workplaces, communities that have all the services you need, as you see in this image, communities that have all the community services and all the social supports that people need and that are mixed together. Density can also only come with an emphasis on transit, a real emphasis on active mobility. If you go to the next slide, the point of this slide, no, the next one, please, this other one, please. Yeah, the point of this slide is that density can't happen by accident. It has to be designed. This is a Vancouver case where we discovered, on the one hand, we wanted the towers because people want to get up and see the views. It's a very big part of their lives. But on the other hand, the streetscapes are so important, the humanity of that, the accessibility, the safety that comes with that. And ultimately, that design has to create a humane quality of environment for people. And then if you go to the third one, and I think this is one of the most important images, and that is that density is all about social diversity. That density, which clusters people separately into ghettos, is not a good idea. The density that accommodates, in this case, you see families with children, that accommodates people, special needs. There's in this image, there's housing for seniors and low-income people. The density that brings everything together is essential. And we found that the key to a lot of this was bringing families, a family environment into the densification equation so that we could actually draw families, since most households have children. So there's good density and there's bad density, but the message is that density doesn't happen by accident. I believe firmly that for the environment, as you see here, Friends of the Environment, for the environment, for the responsible spending that we have to do as governments, the density is essential. But unless people love it, unless people embrace it in a free society, it'll never happen. And that's where the COVID response becomes very germane to our conversation.
Thank you, Larry, for describing good density and how to make density for us. Anna, what about you? What's your 3-point plan to make density enable better cities?
Yeah, I also want to talk about good density and bad density. I'll take you through my images as an introduction. This image here is the Procados Tres Poderes in Brasilia. And the reason I wanted to show it, huge, empty public space, is because I wanted to illustrate how in the aftermath of the Spanish flu 1918 pandemic, architects were very much influenced. Le Corbusier, we know, was very much influenced by actually a desire to avoid crowds and a move towards these kind of clean lines and emptier spaces. This actually image dates from quite significantly later, but I just wanted to show that the influence of that approach. So actually pandemics directly influence architecture, and we know that they did 100 years ago, and similarly we can expect that they will do today as well. So if we just go to the next image, this is a picture of London just a few weeks ago in the middle of lockdown. This is rush hour London, you know, if you can imagine. And well, of course you can imagine, because this has been our reality for the last few months. You know, our cities have been entirely deserted, eerie places to be. So as lockdown begins to ease, as we begin to emerge from lockdown, what does that say for the city spaces we're used to? And what does that say for density? So my final slide, this is a very crowded shopping centre. It's actually Liverpool 1 in Liverpool, huge open air shopping mall, a type of malls without walls place. I've written quite a lot about privately owned, privately controlled, very heavily surveyed shopping centre environments, which aim to maximise footfall above all else, number of shoppers, crowds, in other words. So how is this crowded type of environment going to fare in a post-pandemic city? But of course, it's not just shopping centres. It's all our sort of global attractions in a city like London, our museum spaces. You know, for those of you who know London, the area around London Bridge, near the Tate Modern, Borough Market, these places are absolutely packed. City like New York, very similar. Cities all around the world aim to maximise tourism, footfall. It's all part of the same package. And clearly these sorts of spaces are going to be very, very heavily impacted. We know that. You know, we know that you're going to have to make appointments to visit museums. We're going to have distancing on high streets, in shopping centres. It's going to be a very different experience. So actually this could lead us to a lot of opportunities, I'd like to suggest, where we start to see a different sort of high street emerge and a different sort of city centre, which actually we may enjoy more and may be more in tune with climate change and health and well-being outcomes as well. Public spaces which are genuinely public, that prioritise community hubs and nurture conviviality in place of looking at footfall. So I'm not saying this is what's going to happen, but I'm saying that the space is there to start to have that kind of discussion. And we're certainly being propelled in the right direction by the fact that social distancing is the enemy of footfall and crowds. So I'll leave it there.
Anna and Larry, thank you so much for very quickly summarizing a very important idea to reimagine the future of our cities. I think that is a great way to, dive deep into this important topic. Lucy?
Okay, so I think there's a lot of places you can go with a complex, multifaceted question like density, which has both needs to have more focus on the qualitative than the quantitative. I think before we explore the theme further, I think one thing that might be quite useful to do is to just drill down a little bit into what was it that was so wrong about the way in which density was being practiced before the pandemic? Maybe perhaps characterized by overly quantitative approach. Which developer, not naming any names, but I mean, developers and practitioners across the world were guilty of doing density in a way that we really don't want to be practiced in the future. Perhaps some insights on this theme?
Well, I could start. Number one, a lot of density has not been driven by any kind of public objectives. It's been driven simply by maximize the utility of a piece of land and get as much profitability out of that as you can, and then see how far the consumer's prepared to go in that topic. Sometimes government's been a part of that when they're just trying to get more social housing, good objectives, but didn't really think about all of the implications. That's part of it, but also part of it is that we often thinking about density as a designer, many issues early on just didn't come into play. People were just talking about how do you build more complex buildings. Thirdly is this whole issue that Anna's brought up is so huge. What is the social environment and the legal environment of density? Is it a public place or is it basically a private place? If it's a public place, I think you can depend that there will be different kinds of protocols, perhaps ethics, perhaps principles at play, than if it's a private place where you're just trying to maximize the commercial utility, and perhaps even you end up maximizing security. You end up being exclusive rather than inclusive. So we've had a lot of building that has gone on that simply hasn't taken into consideration the basic ways that human beings need to live together comfortably, respectfully, responsibly, and instead it's just been for very narrow objectives. And the wider we make the objectives and the more that we actually include principles that we abide by and ethics that we abide by in densification, the better it will go. On the other hand, if we go with the inclinations that come out of COVID, which is separate, which is go back to your cars, U.S. Center for Disease Control endorsed people going back to private cars just last week. If we do that, then we're going to push our cities back. And in fact, we're going to despoil the environment so dramatically that there'll be no future. Mm-hmm. So we really have to work on this, and we have to work on it with great passion, but also great humanity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Anna?
Yeah, I mean, I hear exactly what I agree with everything you've said, Larry, and I hear exactly what you're saying with regard to the dangers of moving towards a sort of separate alternative. But they do seem at this early stage, in Europe at least, to be some encouraging signs with regards to transport infrastructure and moves to actually get cars out of the city, because, the links between the virus and pollution, respiratory disease are recognized. So we can't have gridlock in our cities. So actually, all of the subsidies that we're seeing in London, for example, other cities in the UK, to get people on bicycles, pedestrianisation, this seems to be happening at speed around European cities, which you know, for once, actually, it's something that they've been waiting to roll out, and now they seem to have the opportunity to do that. So, you know, there seem to be sort of push and pull factors there. You know, I can see that people want to get in their cars and feel safe in their cars, and that's going to encourage a sort of a suburban regional sort of model. But at the same time, the future of cities, I don't think is going to be car based, but I'm not quite sure what's going to happen to urban centres.
Well, if I could just do a rejoinder on that, I agree totally. We just did a national urban declaration to try to bring the questions of densification and urbanization into the community widely. And you know, the fact is that we have to push hard to remember the basics of human organization. But you know, when you were talking about how sometimes it can be too crowded, it can be too dangerous. That's the downside of density that has to be managed, and it has to be managed carefully. I agree with you totally that environments need to be under the auspices of a government which has a set of principles that really wants to be inclusive of everything and not just have one objective. But if we're not proactive at this point, and that's why I admire the governments you've talked about who have taken the responsibility. If we aren't proactive, people are going to fall back on their most basic inclinations. Fear is going to lead to getting back in your cars and forget transit. Fear is going to lead to move to the suburbs with a big garden so you're nowhere near people. I don't think in the end it's going to create the kind of cities we need, and it's certainly not going to deal with the environmental issues we face. And so we must be proactive. We must be better than we were even before the pandemic. And the pandemic has opened up people's consciousness to doing things a new way. I really agree with you on that. It's a time for a recheck. So we have an opportunity.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, aspects of livability and density in a global city. You know, I don't think a lot of city centre experiences I was having were livable, really. You know, going to parts of London that I've already mentioned, which are just so crowded at the weekend, you know, and they laud themselves as global cities with global visitor attractions. And really what that means is that they're just unmanageable and unpleasant to walk around and be in. And actually you can have maybe a lot better experience as a result, but that will be traded off against who will be having that experience and how will that experience be accessed.
Yeah.
You know, density has been at the heart of the debate on future of cities during this pandemic, especially in places that I've followed it. In India, there's been reams being written about density in places like Mumbai. You know, there's been a lot of conversation on density, and it's really been made the fall guy in a way. The worst reaction to this pandemic could be, like Larry, as you mentioned, moving towards urban sprawl. That will not lead to a sustainable, happier, or healthier world. We all know that. But during this debate and crisis, there's a lot of things that have gone wrong with density in the last decade of speculative real estate and urbanism. And Anna, you mentioned that in your opening remarks. So just to, as we start this conversation, to frame the view on how to make density work for us, can we start with describing what do you mean by density? Larry, you also referred to the distinction between crowding and density, which is very important to us. Anna mentioned this whole angle of speculative urbanism, which is really exclusionary. And the symbol of those are those high-rise towers in our capital cities that are, you know, places of parking capital for the world's oligarchs. So as we start this discussion, can we start by describing what do we mean by urban density? Larry?
Well, I you know, number one, density can be crowding, but crowding can be separate from density, if you see what I mean. As I look at density, it's bringing people closer together. It's more efficient use of land. It's taking pressure off of natural places. It's conserving space for public activities. But if that's all it is, then yes, maybe some environmental objectives are served, but people will hate it. And unfortunately, in most of the world, people have choices, and the more choices they have, the more we have to address their expectations and their needs. So to me, density is always about quality. It is always about both community amenities and a community ethic, and it's about commercial provisions, and it is about making sure that everyone has access to that place that you're creating. So yes, here in Vancouver, where all over the world people bring money to invest it, we said that 20% of the housing in these communities have to be low-income housing. Now we're having a big problem with middle-income housing, so we're starting programs to insist on middle-income housing. And so densification, while it is a very good thing, we know in principle, it can be so poorly done that it becomes counter to our objectives, and it becomes negative. My work in parts of the world that are more developing has also shown something else, which is sometimes it just happens spontaneously as people come from rural to urban. They come for better life, and there's no accommodation, there's no infrastructure, there's no standards. Those are creating the kind of cities, the barrios, that we have to evolve out of and find answers for. So density is our best solution for the future, but it is a very, very dangerous thing if not done in the right way. And it can be very exclusive. I think Anna's made that point very, very well. But it can also be very hurtful and harmful to your life experience and everything about your family and your life, unless it's done well.
Yeah, I think that it's a term that we have to be really careful about. And we have to define what we're actually talking about. I think for the purposes of this discussion, it's a nice umbrella for us to discuss, the direction of the busy city in a post-pandemic environment. But actually, when we're talking about what does density actually mean, are we talking about density of buildings? Are we talking about density of people? Obviously, it's both. We've talked about this good density and this bad density. For me, I've written a lot about the housing crisis and speculative development and privatized public space. So that definition that Larry mentioned around maximizing the use of land, developers wanting to get absolutely the most out of every parcel of land, that's got a lot of negative consequences. On the other hand, densification, refurbishing housing, particularly for affordable and social housing, the links with the diverse urban environments, obviously that's sounds like a much more positive, to me at any rate, sort of density. So I think it's a term we have to be really careful about, and to have a really focused discussion on it. We have to then sort of actually define what it is we're really talking about. And what we're really talking about is, what sort of city are we wanting to live in, and what sort of city are we wanting to move towards?
I have to say, Anna, I could not agree with you more. I have been in meetings among planners, and they'll have a map and it'll say dense, X units per acre or X number of people, whatever here, and it'll say something else over here. And you say to yourself, that could happen in a great way, or it could be terrible. If that's all you said as a government, that you want density, you could be creating more problems. Don't, be careful what you ask for, because with it all has to come the entire equation. You've started to articulate that equation. That equation is a rich equation, and intelligent governments, intelligent cities are realizing that you have to do the whole thing. You know, I was in a session, I chaired a session in Rotterdam last year, where we were talking about the crowding with tourism and how it's killing cities and what needs to be done about that. So you can see, unless you bring the whole agenda into play, you've got a very dangerous proposition there. It's like a lion, and you either it's managed or it's not.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's been this tendency, for at least the last 15 years or so, to think of density as, a good thing. The urban renaissance, getting people back into cities, the opposite of the car-led society, cafe culture. But actually, it's quite a narrow terminology, and we have to go much further in articulating what it is we actually mean.
Yeah.
Definitely. This maybe, I think, leads us on to a question which considers the relationship between density and diversity, because one dimension of the Vancouverism model, which argued that density could be done very well so long as it was achieved by being by livable strategies, by whatever means that they consisted of. That is something about mixed use, essentially, I would say. And that's one dimension also of retrofitting actual high-density environments, such as favelas and barrios, where, for example, you have Urban Think Tank adding urban gyms to very, very high-density slums and informal settlements that are not going to go away tomorrow. The question is how to intelligently retrofit them and manage them so that they're the best that they can be, with certain sewage systems and so on. I mean, that's a long way of asking quite a kind of easy question, which is, what's the relationship between density and genuine diversity in terms of responding in a genuine way to the needs that people have?
Anna, do you want to start, or I can start? Whichever.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that I'd want to have a sort of more thoughtful response to, because again, there's a sort of tendency for density and diversity to go hand in hand. Density equals busyness, equals lots of different people. And I guess it's the interrelationships between the groups that you're bringing together and the access to the amenities which are on offer, actually that really matters. So again, I would probably just sort of, actually let's drill down and what do we mean when we're talking about diversity? And I look at it in a sort of right to the city context. Diversity in and of itself, what does that actually mean? Are we talking about everybody having maximum access to amenities? Or are we talking about the presence of lots of different groups within a relatively small space? Again, we have to sort of start to define our discussion, I think.
Yeah, I agree with Anna. We've always been very anxious in my part of the world about the natural tendency of the marketplace to basically ghettoize. The rich are all here, the poor are all here. The rich get all the supports and assistance. The poor are just left to fend for themselves. And we've had that ghettoization. So there is a piece of this that has to do with trying to work to manage what might be a market inclination to take us apart as a society by public policy and responsible development that tries to put us back together. Putting us back together, though, often And then, take families with children, that's another level of the same thing. It has become, until recently, anyone with children would think they had to leave the density, at least in my part of the world. Now we're showing that you can be a part of a more intensive, diverse place with your children. But, on the other side of that, one of the themes that became so big for us was called neighborliness, which is the responsibility that individuals have with one another as they come closer together and as they enjoy the benefits, that they also respect the all aspects of what living closer together means. And so neighborliness in many ways, views, privacy, noise, these kind of issues come into play as well. My favorite image of today is that image of Brasilia, not for what that image shows, but for what that image doesn't show, which is Brasilia's really interesting part is not the part that was designed by planners and architects. It's the part that was built to house the workers to build the city. It's where their diversity is. It's where the energy is. It's where people have learned in an organic way to live together and to, be neighborly. And it's frankly where you go once you see the sights in Brasilia to really enjoy Brazilian life and Brazilian people and Brazilian culture. And that's almost metaphorical to me about the design program can often tell a lot about what happens. And when the design program is trying to replicate the kind of organic inclination of people to be together and to enjoy society, we get better results.
Larry, as a follow-up to that, in your book, Vancouverism, and in Vancouver, you used density as a tool to deliver livability as well as inclusion. And in a way, in your book, you refer to this as minimizing the impacts of density while maximizing the day-to-day livability. What were the mechanisms you used to comprehensively enable livability, but also inclusion? Because one of the things that is coming very strongly in this conversation is that it's all in layers. It's not going to be black and white. It's not an easy question to answer about what is density. And, there's layers of black and white, good and bad. And how can cities maximize the benefits and minimize the impacts?
There's a secret about densification that few people know about. And the secret is that the amount of wealth created through densification is so extraordinary that it would shock you in terms of as you compare to where you would invest your money elsewhere. And what we tried to do in our city is we said that opportunity for a developer to densify and therefore tap into that amazing wealth component, which can be hundreds and hundreds of % of profit over investment, that has to be shared. That has to be shared with the public through public policy, through our regulatory regime, through all the mechanisms we have in government, so that, yes, there is profitability to densification, but out of that also comes a source of funds to do all the things that we're talking about from a public objective that don't naturally happen often through the private initiative. Sometimes yes, but not often. So accommodation for social housing for low-income people, qualities of the city, standards of open space, amounts of open space, public facility requirements of all kinds of layers, the quality of the building of the unit, the building of units and buildings suitable for families with children rather than just singles. All of those things cost money, and would not happen unless there was a way to tap that amazing wealth. Fortunately, in an up market, that wealth is there. There's plenty of money for profitability, so it doesn't, developers are going to develop, but there's extra wealth there to do many of the things we need to do. The nice thing about our community is that many developers also discovered it made their products better, more interesting, and therefore more marketable. And so we formed a bit of a collaboration, but it was driven by public policy, and not just policy, public imperative that some of that wealth be invested according to an agenda that had been established by citizens through many public processes, and was integrated into the law and the regulatory framework of the city. And that's how we've done it. And where cities have done that, you see better cities. Northern European cities do that almost by definition. Where that isn't done, you'll see incredible profitability removed from those economies often, and you'll just see people living with whatever the impacts of density are.
Anna, in your...
Yeah, I mean, and, we in London are very much in that situation. We've had this drive towards the densification of our cities and the building of a certain type of development, which really has kind of reached quite extreme levels in the last few years. And that hasn't been shared out at all. I mean, not only has it not been shared out, we've had the development of certain policies. I mean, for the UK viewers, we've got this policy which developed called financial viability, which is this new mechanism whereby developers can basically contribute less than they were contributing before, because they can make arguments about how schemes won't be financially viable unless they're not liable for providing social housing infrastructure, whatever it may be, and we have this investor-led housing market and huge housing crisis in London and in other UK cities. And I know that somewhere like Vancouver is not immune from that. Canadian cities, North American cities, cities around the world are all facing this housing crisis. But actually, I think we really are on the sort of the pioneering edge, because we haven't shared out those spoils of densification at all. And I mean, to make matters even worse, actually, our design standards are very low. We're building the smallest housing in Europe, and actually very often people aren't buying it. As I think was already mentioned, these are safety deposit boxes in the sky. They're just, they're places for global capital to reside. That's essentially what it's about. So actually, the densification has divorced the city from, it's just become a financial instrument, really.
And I couldn't agree more with you. And that's where the involvement of public government, public policy becomes so important. And even in Vancouver, I'll tell you, we've done this probably what I've described more than many places in the world, and yet we still did not allocate the amount that came to the public in the right way. We still have an affordability crisis. We still need to find new measures.
You have a tax on foreign investment, don't you?
Oh, we have huge foreign investment.
Yeah, but you have a tax on foreign investment, don't you?
Yeah, we do have a tax on foreign investment, but it is...
I always quote it in my presentations.
Yeah, but it does...
And I say in Vancouver, this is what they do, and in London, we wouldn't dream of doing that.
Yeah, but my point is that even with all of our success, and I admit I'm proud of that, we still have to manage that wealth that comes back into the public. Number one, the public has to insist that wealth come. It has to be understood to be a part of the privilege of development in a community, and then it has to be allocated where the problems are, and it has to be reallocated. For example, now we're moving into more secure middle income housing because we have a crisis of world interest in terms of our middle income housing. So I agree that often, and by the way, many of the things that came into our consciousness during my time were things that we learned from England and Europe and elsewhere, where you were very far ahead. And many of those things changed with the politics, the more recent politics of your countries as well. I still get very inspired by Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and the Northern European countries, because many of that sense of the social contract is still in place. And so there does need to be, any developer, even the most aggressive developer, knows that they have to form a social contract, and it has to include a public agenda. And where that doesn't happen, density is going to be a mess.
Yeah, well, that's what we've got here, in my view.
Okay, actually, so this leads very nicely on to the next question, specifically for Anna, concerning your big capital, who is London for? And it's a little bit of, it's a devil's advocate question, because one of your reviewers, Dave Hill, the founder of On London, we were thinking about, in Big Capital, you discussed the merits of increasing housing estate density in London, which is a practice that's become much more widespread lately, via infill and refurbishment strategies. And Dave Hill, when he reviewed your book, he asked whether is it always painless, practical, or preferable to knocking stuff down and starting again, including for existing residents?
I mean, my view is that where you don't have to knock buildings down, it's better not to, in so many ways. There will be exceptions to that. You know, there will be buildings which are in such a terrible state of disrepair that is no longer the case. But where you can refurbish, it's better for the carbon footprint. I mean, the carbon footprint of knocking down large estates is absolutely enormous. And for the communities who live there. I mean, despite the best efforts of local authorities to return communities to their original residencies, when those best efforts happen, which is, to be honest, in the minority of cases, but in the few instances when real efforts are made, actually a very small percentage return. I mean, on the Biker estate, for example, which is a classic example, Ralph Erskine, classic example of an estate built in the late 1970s, community-led development, where every effort was made for the residents of the biker community to move into the new biker. Only 17% actually did. And that was in a particular situation where that was the aim of the whole thing. You know, nowadays, residents are always told, yes, you will be able to move in, and then the goalposts move. And actually, by the time 5-10 years later, developments are built, the amounts of social and affordable housing have shrunk down so much, and the amount of people who do end up living there is tiny. And this decimates communities. You know, and that's very, very damaging to the social fabric. So, you know, my reasons aren't really, my reasons are sort of social policy reasons as much as anything, which as well as the carbon footprint reason. I mean, Dave Hill wasn't the biggest fan of my book. I think he said it was bedside reading for Guardian readers. So I think he takes a very different view to myself of the kind of luxury apartment developments with minimal affordable housing, which we've just been discussing, than I do.
Can I just add to that? I know that's primarily a question for Anna, but I couldn't agree with her more, and there's another reason as well. what we've discovered here in North America is that you better be careful when you demolish things, because often you are demolishing social networks, support systems, very delicate and very subtle relationships where people have found ways to be with one another, support one another, and all of that. And so, urban renewal here is just completely unacceptable anymore. And even in America, which has its problems, they had a program called Hope 6, where they took those terrible, very dense and very awful, often public housing projects, and they started insinuating diversity. They started renovations. They often found there was plenty of room to do what they needed to do. So not only do you save the carbon footprint, do you take pressure off of the pollution that's outrageously going into our systems, and avoid displacement, which, by the way, is way more impactful on people than anyone who's a middle class, upper middle class person could ever understand. But also that delicate social fabric, which is often there, even when an outsider might say there's social problems here, often they're not sensitive to the delicacy of what's going on. So sometimes it's necessary. A building's falling down. I worked in Abu Dhabi where we knew we had to demolish 400 buildings because if we didn't, they were going to fall down around the residents. But by the same token, it's something I'm always very leery about in terms of the unintended consequences of what happens when you do that.
Turn to in relation to the short and the long.
Mic was off briefly.
Oh.
Could you start again?
If we return to the density question in relation to the short and the longer term impacts of COVID situation. So it's got two sides to it, this question, it seems to me. You've got factors like, there's now obviously a greater value is going to be placed on external amenity space. And also people are looking at the possibilities of remote working, which could lead to reduction in high density housing in central areas. While on the other hand, the evidence is very strong that compact urban development has huge, very, very high degree of benefit for public health and for fighting climate emergency situations. So where does this leave this? I mean, we need to rethink density, but can we include both of those polarities in the discussion?
Well, I might start on that one. To me, the basic imperatives of urbanism, the environment, and really accommodating all the needs of communities and individuals have not changed because of COVID. Before COVID came along, we were fighting, at least in my part of the world, the inclination of consumers, particularly as they have more options, to move to the suburbs and sprawl all over natural environments and to get out of public transit into their cars and create a lot of pollution. And there was a lot of social alienation that came with that no one really talked about. We're still fighting that battle. Unfortunately, COVID has created more arguments for those who would not agree with the kind of sustainable city that we talk about. And we have to address those things. We know now that we have to have standards for seniors' care facilities, which are very dense places always, or usually. We know that we have to have new protocols for transit. But those are changes in the battle that we are fighting anyway to reshape our cities so that in the long run, we can be responsible and consistent with the ecologies, the natural ecologies in which we sit. And so I find the one real benefit of COVID that we can take advantage of in a positive way is that it's opened people's thinking about how their day-to-day habits. Now, will they go with the worst of those habits, or will they begin to enjoy some new choices? Well, if we give them some good new choices, then I find consumers, they're interested. But if you just leave it to their natural inclinations, of course they're going to go to the most conservative choice. And that's what I think is at play here. And that's why I think this moment is so important, that we remind everyone of what we're trying to do with cities, that we're trying to save this planet for their grandchildren. And that to some degree has to do with the choices they make today with their families, with their with whatever resources they have. I did want to comment on one thing, and that's your idea of the working at home. Number one, I'm a little skeptical that that's going to dramatically change. I find that all around me, people can't wait to get back to the society of work, but there will be more working at home. I see that as a great benefit to the 15-minute community. I see that as a great benefit to driving our neighborhoods to be more diverse and to be more fulfilling. And I think it doesn't have anything to do with lowering or upping density. It has to do with accommodating a new use that we weren't accommodating so much in the past. That's a good thing. You know, if my commuter trip can be from, you know, my main floor to my second floor, or from my kitchen to my den, then, you know, that takes a lot of pressure off the urban systems too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just to interject sort of one moment, I always tell my students not to introduce a new idea at the end of an essay. And I just want to introduce a new idea right at the end of the conversation.
Go ahead.
Because I think that, you know, we've had a very sort of positive conversation here about the opportunities of the post-pandemic city. And I totally agree with Larry that actually it's a chance to think about cities in a new way. And there are lots of opportunities. I'm you know, very hopeful. We don't have quite the same pressures on suburbanism as I think, you know, you do in North America. You know, I think the sort of vision of a kind of London, a city of villages, you know, it could actually have kind of quite a lot of traction. So, and, you know, a more egalitarian city could emerge. I think there's all sorts of things in the mix. But what concerns me, which we haven't mentioned, is that in the event of a real estate crash, which really might just be around the corner, actually, we could start to see some very, very worrying trends, which are, again, already present in cities, come in and really gobble up our communities in the shape of massive private equity companies, which are very active in housing and actually in other parts of the city. And so that's something that, you know, perhaps I should have mentioned earlier, and apologies for doing so right at the end, but I couldn't let the positive discussion go without being reminded of this.
Yeah.
And I have to reinforce that. One of the biggest worries I see is that all that we've cared about will be turned into, you know, the market's crashed, we have to get it going again. Drop all the rules, drop all the requirements and the standards, just, you know, approve development and get on with it. And the net effect will be that we fall backwards. And then we'll find that the public investments that could have been put into positive things like providing childcare and community facilities and all that are put into negative things, the health issues and trying to, you know, desperately save our environment. So I agree totally. It means that this is a time that governments have to be incredibly diligent, but also nonprofits and people who are trying to take a social responsibility in our cities have to be very diligent and have to be very proactive and have to really try to make sure that the agenda doesn't get destroyed just out of expediency.
Brilliant.
This is such a brilliant, diverse conversation with tons of layers. I think for me, you know, just moving away from just looking at cities as a function of aesthetics, architecture, and living, you know, capital and finance plays a bigger role in making density work. And I love the conversation because you highlighted some of those points, because that has to be at the back of our mind as urbanists and policymakers. And at this moment, and we are completely out of time, so I am just going to quickly highlight some audience comments. Just want to say thank you all for joining us from all over the world. Grado says, congratulations, we need to rethink cities. Hazel Bingham says, I think to Anna, ground control was brilliant for my dissertation research. And Rafa Hernandez says, we need your new vision. So thank you all, the great audience that joins us. And I really enjoyed this conversation, Larry and Anna. Lucy?
Thank you so much. It was immensely fertile. I just knew you would be a brilliant pairing, and it's provoked an awful lot of thoughts that we can reflect on later, and hopefully we can use to boost and propel our own work going forward. So, I mean, thank you so much to the two of you, and thank you so much to the audience. I hope the audience, viewers will continue to watch every week. I can announce that next week the theme of our webinar is co-housing shared living. And next week, which is on Tuesday the 16th of June, 4:30 p.m. BST, 5:30 CEST, 9 o'clock IST, and 11:30 EDT, or check your local time zone. We're very happy to say we have Verena von Beckereth, who is an architect and co-founder of Heidi von Beckereth in Berlin, who is a co-housing expert. And we have Francis Wright, who is a lawyer and who is the head of community partnering for a very, very fine, interesting developer based here in the UK. Town is responsible for Marmalade Lane co-housing development in North Cambridge. So we hope that you will check it out either live, or you can watch it on our various channels, YouTube and Facebook, at your leisure. So thank you very much. And Prathima, any last words, or shall we call it a wrap?
I love this conversation so much, Lucy. We have to get Larry and Anna to have lunch with us sometime when things open up, because it was such a rich conversation. We didn't even have to be here. We have to organize a real meeting of minds between Vancouver and London. So thank you all for joining us. Have a safe time and stay well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.